Hello, everyone. I'm Viktor. I used to work on the Flutter team when I lived in Silicon Valley. Now I'm the founder of Serverpod. I'm also the main organizer of the Full Stack Flutter conference, which we held online earlier this year. Today, I'm going to talk about how I made my slide deck and then how I made this presentation. So this may be the most meta talk you attend this conference. So why did I make my own slide deck? Last year, I held a talk here at Fluttercon about building multiplayer games with Serverpod. And I figured it was really hard to do this with Keynote for many reasons. And I got a lot of questions afterwards how I made my slide deck. So I figured it could be a good topic for a talk. Plus, I'm also going to talk a little bit about real-time communication and how I made the remote control for the slide deck. I wanted to do slides like this, not just with an animation, but actual code running on your slides. Or like this, where you can actually demonstrate concepts by moving things and changing. I talked a little bit about noise functions and how you can make animations. So let's see. Stuff like this is really hard to do in Keynote. So that's why I figured, yeah, let's make this in Flutter. But there's also other things that are a bit tricky to do in Keynote if you haven't made a presentation. Doing slides with code is tricky because typically you want to copy your code from VS Code or your code editor, or you take screenshots. But then you want to edit the code afterwards, and then you need to go back, take a new screenshot. And most of the time, when you take screenshots from VS Code, it's pretty hard to do the screenshots and get the sizes right on the slides. Plus, you often want to use code that may not be complete, but code snippets that are not actually runnable code. And if you do that, you get the nasty red underlines and all that stuff, and you don't want that in your slides. And then you have made all your screenshots and figure you want to change the background on your slides. Then you need to take them all again. So I figured, hey, must be much better writing your slides in Flutter, right? Because then we can do the code styling programmatically. So I wrote a little other package actually for this that makes the exact same code styling as VS Code. We can build interactive slides like the ones I showed before. And we all love Flutter, so that's a plus. And I made it super easy with a Slick Slides package, so that's available on PubDev if you want to try this out yourselves. So how do you actually build your slide deck? First, you create a slide deck. It's just a widget, and you add your slides to it. So this is an example of a slide here. So this is the very first slide that I showed. It just is a person slide. It says I'm the founder of Serverpod, and I'm Viktor, and has an image of me. And this is what that looked like. So right, that's cool. But what about that fancy animated code we just saw? Well, I'm happy you asked. So this is what I'm talking about here, right? We have a piece of code, and then we can actually type it in or animate it in like we're typing and highlight different rows. So how do we do this with Slick Slides? This is what an animated code slide looks like in Slick Slides. You just add an animated code slide, and you add a title, or title is optional, I guess, and then you add formatted code blocks, and it will figure out how to animate between those using the same sort of diff as you would with Git, for instance. And then you can highlight certain lines and use different computer languages for syntax highlighting. So that's cool. But what about that fancy controller app you're using to move between the slides? Well, I'm happy that you asked, because that will be the main topic of this talk. And obviously, I'm the founder of Serverpod, so I made it with Serverpod. And I wanted to check with you guys, how many of you have heard about Serverpod before attending Fluttercon this year? Oh, wow, that's almost all of you. But it may not be surprising you're the ones coming to my talk. How many of you have tried it out? So that's about half. How many of you guys have actually built an app with Serverpod? Yeah, we have a few. So we would love to talk with you guys and happy to showcase whatever you build with Serverpod in our social media. So I wanted to give a quick introduction to Serverpod and how it works before we get going with building the remote. Serverpod is an open source, scalable app server written in Dart for the Flutter ecosystem. And we solved some really big issues you have while doing your backend. First and foremost, you can use the same computer language across the whole stack, and Dart is a great language on server too. And this means that you can also share code between your app and your server or your backend. And that can be huge. Then we made some pretty cool innovations in Serverpod. So you actually add your methods on your server, and then we'll analyze your server code and replicate those same methods in your app or your client. This means that when you call a server method, it's just like calling a local method in your app. We added some other great features to Serverpod, like we made logging really good. I'm going to show that. We have a visual logger. We made accessing the database super easy. It's a Dart-first ORM. So we made it with native Dart types. We have support for database relations, database migrations. It's a very complete solution, and you get like all the type safety and the support from your autocomplete in the editor while using it, which is really nice. We also built a caching layer that can be run locally on your server, or you can even use it across a cluster of servers. And caching is often an afterthought when you build your server, but it's really neat to have there the day you need it, because it's something that can save a lot of database calls, and database calls are typically what are the most expensive part when you build a server. So you want to really minimize those, and having a good cache can be huge for that. Then we're covering pretty much everything you would expect from a modern backend framework. You can upload files. We can authenticate with Google. If you authenticate with Google, you also get access to all the server-side Google APIs that you can call on the user's behalf, which is actually pretty tricky to do if you build it from scratch. You can authenticate with Apple Firebase, which covers pretty much any social sign-in. You can stream data, so that's something I'm going to talk a little bit in more detail about today. You can schedule tasks. So we have something called future calls in Serverpod, which means that you can call a method sometime in the future. Say you have a user who signs up for your app, and you want them to you want to send them an email to remind them 1 week from now. You just make a future call, and Serverpod will serialize that to the database and pull it out when it's time to send the email, and it will get sent, even if you restart the server, or it will work on many servers. We perform health checks, both on like Serverpod itself, but also on any, you can add your custom services here to check that they are looking good and are alive. We made it really easy to deploy Serverpod both to Google Cloud and AWS with Terraform scripts, but we are building our own Serverpod Cloud that will be available this fall. That will be literally a one-liner to deploy your server. So if you start building something today, when you're ready to deploy it, you can do that with Serverpod Cloud. We have this cool visual log viewer. This is something I needed myself when I built servers in the past, because some tasks can be really hard. Especially a common cause for your server to be slow is that you have a slow database query somewhere, maybe because you forgot to index a table, or you made an unoptimal query. And with Serverpod, you can just pinpoint the calls that are slow, and then you can turn on logging for that specific method. You can find those queries that were slow, and the queries are even stored together with a stack trace. So you can just click on the stack trace, and it will take you right back to the code where you made that query. So that's something that can take hours to do if you download I don't know if anyone tried to download logs from a SQL and try to run that through some analyzer and stuff. It's hard work and not too fun. And here you can do it with like 2 clicks. So next, I want you to go through some of the basics of Serverpod, which will sort of lead up to how we do real-time communication. On Serverpod, you work with endpoints. An endpoint is basically a connection point to the server. And you can add methods to an endpoint. So you place all your endpoints in our endpoints directory of your server, and it needs to extend the endpoint class. And all the methods you add that you want to make accessible from your app needs to return a typed future, and the first parameter needs to be a session object. The session object is a little bit like the build context in Flutter, so it contains all the sort of metadata around your call, and it gives you access to the database, to logging, to communication within the server, or if you have multiple servers between the servers. This is an example of what this can look like. So this is really the simplest sort of endpoint with a method in it. So we call this example endpoint. It extends the endpoint class. When we run this through our code generation for the client, it will remove the endpoint name. So you'll access this endpoint with just the example. And then we added one method to it, and that's the hello method. It returns a typed future, which is a string, so it's a future string. The first parameter is the session object, and then we can have any number of other parameters here. So in this case, we just have another string, but this can be your models or other Dart primitives. And we just return the name with hello before it. So let's look at how we call this from our app. So we just do the access the Serverpod client, and we have all the endpoints there. We have an example endpoint in this case, and then the hello method. And that's really all you need to do to call the methods on your server. So whenever you add a new method to your server, you run serverpod generate. It will analyze your server, and then you can just call them from your app. That easy. Secondly, there's another part typically to server communication, and that's models and serialization of data. In Serverpod, we define the models in YAML files, and we picked YAML over potentially another solution could be to use annotations in Dart to create the serializations and code generation that way. But we picked YAML files for a couple of reasons. They're very, very easy to read, and also sometimes you want to have a little bit different code for your models on the server versus the client. For instance, on the server, you may want to have access to all the database things and the models for connecting to the database. You don't want those in the client necessarily, like 99.9% of times probably. But then you can also have fields that are available only on the server. So say you store a password on the server, you never want to pass that to the client. You can just say, this is a server-only attribute. And when you parse the same model on the client, that will not be there. So for those reasons, it's convenient. Also, this allows us to, in the future, right now we have support for Flutter and Dart, but in the future we can add a code generator for, say, JavaScript and TypeScript, and then you could use this with React Native or on your web page, stuff like that. It already generates a JSON REST API, so I mean, it's well defined. You can do this already, but it would be nice to also have the code generation. You just place the models in your models directory of your server, and then you run serverpod generate to generate all the Dart code. And so this is an example of what one of these YAML files can look like. So here we have a class called company, and it has a couple of fields. It has the name of the company, the founded date, and the list of employees. So you can create lists and maps here, and pretty much all Dart primitive types. You can even refer to other objects or other models from your model. You can also use combine this with freezed, for instance, if you have some things you want to serialize another way. And when you use this in your code, you just use it like any Dart class. I guess I made this slide a while ago. We are now, not just me, but we are 4 full-time persons working on Serverpod, and from August we will be 7. And then you can access the properties just like you would expect. So it's very straightforward. It also creates a few other convenience methods, like a copy with method and stuff like that. So that's all good, but how do we interact with this in real time? And that's, I should say, we added a feature, or sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. But yeah, real-time communication seems hard, and it's because it kind of is. There's a bunch of things you need to keep track of to make real-time communication work. You need to implement some sort of a custom protocol. Typically, a good choice is WebSockets, because that will work on both web and in apps. Another option could be to use raw sockets, but that will not work on web or Flutter web. And then you need to handle the sort of connection lifecycle. What happens if internet goes down? What happens if you just don't receive a message at some point? What if we need to access multiple sources? So maybe you have 2 chats. Should I open up 2 WebSockets to each chat? Or how do I need to have some routing in my server to get these to the right place? How do I do authentication? Say you are signed into the admin secret chat and then you lose access and need to be kicked out. How do we handle that? What about logging? Logging can be pretty tricky if you have multiple sessions going at a time that spans over a long time. So we're introducing in Serverpod something we call streams as parameters. I should say that we had hoped to have this ready for Fluttercon, but it will be ready in about 2 weeks. We have a few more tests to write, so you will be able to play with this very soon. So the thing we're doing, instead of returning a typed future from your methods in the server, you can now return a stream with your model files, or it can be actually any type of serializable object in Serverpod. And then you just call this method from your client and you return that stream. And you can have multiple streams at once, and we'll pipe it through the same WebSocket. We handle all the routing within the server. And you can even pass in streams or multiple streams to a single method, and we'll just figure it out and pass the things to the right places. So let's have a look at what this looks like in practice. So this is maybe the simplest of all examples, right? So we have a method. This will be in your endpoint, if you look at the top code block here, that count down from 10 to 1. So we just make a loop, and Dart has a really nice API or construct for working with streams. I don't know if you played around with it, but basically, if you use the async star, you can just yield the values. So you don't have to work with a stream controller. It's very, very easy to do. So you make a loop, and whenever you have a value ready that you want to send to the server, or a model, or anything else, you just yield that value. And Serverpod will take care of all the serialization, the protocol, the authentication, making sure if this is an authenticated endpoint, you lose access to that, you will just shut down the stream immediately. Then in your client code, you can just access that stream by calling that method. So we have the countdown method. I just named this my endpoint. You probably you can name the endpoint whatever, obviously. And then you use the await for, or you can also listen to the stream to get the values. And here we just set the state. So that's how that countdown works. All right, let's have a look at a real-world example then. And the real-world example will be the app I'm using to control this presentation today. First, we need a model for handling the actions in your remote control. And right now, I just have an action for going to the next slide and to the previous slide. So it's pretty easy. So I made an enum. Serverpod models have support not just for classes, but enums and even exceptions. Exceptions are actually pretty cool. You can cast an exception on the server and serialize it and catch it on the client, which is great for error handling. So that's a neat little feature. But for this example, we're just using an enum with the next and the previous value. Next, we need an endpoint where we handle these actions that we send from the client. So I call that a remote control endpoint. We'll remove the endpoint part of this, so we'll access it by just remote control, and then we have a next method on this endpoint. And this next method, we access the message central of Serverpod, and the message central is available on the session object. So that's the messages here. And that allows us to pass messages internally in our server on different named streams. So you basically name a stream by a string, and then you can listen to these from different parts of your server, or any part of your server. So, or actually, if you have multiple servers, you can pass them between servers as well, and that just works seamlessly. And we right now using Redis for that inter-server pub-sub communication. So what we'll do, we have a channel that we call the remote actions, and then we just pass in the remote action next, which is the enum we made. And since we made it as a Serverpod model file, it will be serializable, so we can pass that both to the client or internally in the server, or between servers. And for completeness, we're also adding a previous method here that does exactly the same thing. It just goes to the previous slide or sends the previous message on that channel. Next, we need an endpoint for our slide deck that also connects to the server and then passes on these messages that from the remote control to the server. So we will return a stream of remote actions here, and we just call this method actions. And first we need access to a stream of these messages, and we get that through the message central. And we have this remote actions channel where we get internal server messages. And then we can just listen for these actions, and we yield them back to our slide deck. And what's really neat, if we use this get stream from the message central, it will be aware of the session we're using. So whenever that connection is broken, it will just end the stream for us automatically. So it's an easy way to exit this loop. Otherwise, we could indefinitely listen for messages on a stream, and then we'd never return. And even if we disconnected, we will still be doing stuff in the server. Oops, sorry. And that's something we probably don't want to do. Yeah, that's the endpoint for the slide deck. Let's look at how we call these methods from our apps. So this is from the remote control. So, I just have an elevated button for the backend forward button. And when I press it, I go to the client. Remote control is the name of the endpoint, and call the next method. And let's skip back a few slides. What's happening here? We're accessing the next method on the server. We post that message in the internal messaging system of the server, which will then be passed on to our other, we listen to that stream in our other endpoint that we connect to with our slide deck and return those values. So let's look at the slide deck. So this is a part of the slide deck where I actually added into the init state method of the slide deck. I'm creating a client, so whenever you create that widget, we create the client, and that's basically the code for setting up that client. That was you need to have that somewhere in your app, and then we start handling network events, and this is what that method looks like. So basically here we just access the action stream. So from the client we get to the slide deck, which is the name of that endpoint, and call the actions method, which returns the stream. And the stream has our actions, which are just the enums with backend, next and previous. And here we just check if it's the next, message, we go to the next slide. If it's the previous, we call the onPrevious method. So that's really all the server code I needed to make this little demo and client code. So I hope this gave you some inspiration for getting started. This will be available in Serverpod in the next 2 weeks. With Serverpod 2.1, we're also adding some other cool features there. So I suggest you go to serverpod.dev. Make sure you follow us on social media on Serverpod Dev on X, or we're also on LinkedIn, obviously. And you can follow me on Viktor Lidholt or on X. If you go to serverpod.news, we have a newsletter there that you can join, and you get all the updates. It's we don't send many messages. It's like once a month tops, but just the stuff we are adding to Serverpod if you want to stay up to date. With that, I'm opening the floor for any questions that you may have.